EEG class. Today we're going to talk about actually what within the brain physiologically we have that generates the EEG signal. So what is it that generates the EEG? We know that EEG is basically generated due to electrical activity within the brain. So let's understand a few things about the nervous system, specifically about the central nervous system, which is within the brain. So there are two key parts to the nervous system. First is the peripheral nervous system, and that's the part of the nervous system that's distributed through the body. So the nerves that drive the muscles in your arms and legs, for example, are part of the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the part of the nervous system that's in the brain. So this would be primarily the neurons in your brain, and they constantly communicate not only with the peripheral nervous system through the spinal cord, but also with each other. So while we're on this topic, there are a couple of additional terms. One is afferent path. An afferent path would be a neural pathway that connects the sensory nerves in the peripheral nervous system to the brain or the central nervous system. And then an efferent path is basically the opposite. These would be neurons that connect the motor neurons, the motor controlling neurons that are in the brain, so that portion of the motor cortex that controls motion from the brain to the body through motor nerves. So the nervous system can be further divided into two categories. The somatic system, which is the part of the nervous system that gives us conscious control over things, and also the part of the nervous system responsible for physical sensations. So any action that you take, walking, vision, hearing, any action that you take that requires conscious thought or interpretation would be part of your somatic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that regulates beyond consciousness. So even if you are asleep, this part of the nervous system continues to function, and this would be the part of the nervous system that regulates body functions like your heart rate, bladder activity, digestive activity, and so on. Within that autonomic nervous system, you can make two additional categories: the sympathetic nervous system, which is dominant during activity, and the parasympathetic, which is dominant during relaxation. So what are neurons? Neurons are cells. They're a special type of cell, and they're the basic unit in the nervous system. And there are three types that we will think about in this class. Sensory neurons are neurons that are connected to sensory receptors. Motor neurons are neurons that are connected to muscles, so both of these occur in the peripheral nervous system. Interneurons are neurons that are connected to other neurons. So you have a lot of interneurons within the brain connected to other neurons and constantly communicating among each other. So this is just a picture taken from an open source site on the National Institute of Health that shows a number of different neurons, how this cartoon might look within the brain. And there are some terms. The first term is the soma. That's the main body of the cell. So you see these areas that look like little globs here that actually have some volume to them and are not long and stringy. Those would be the soma. The dendrites are these filamentary branches that are typically quite short, and they receive signals from other neurons, often less than 2 millimeters long. So kind of hard to point out down here in this area. You can see some of these shorter, some of the shorter connections. Those would be dendrites. The axons are the other filamentary particles shown in the cartoon, and they would be the longer filaments. They range from 1 millimeter to 1 meter long, and they're actually the branches that transmit a signal to another neuron. So axons, in electrical engineering language, axons would be the transmission line, and dendrites would be the receiver. the actual place where the communication occurs is in the synapse. And the synapse is actually a junction where one axon connects to another neuron. And that's blown up in this figure here. So within the synapse, there's some conversion from an electrical signal to a chemical signal back to an electrical signal. And everything that goes on in the synapse is a function of what the neurotransmitters or nervous system chemicals are that are in that synapse. And by changing the chemical structure or the chemical balance in the synapse, we can actually change the electromagnetic properties of the neuron as a conductor. So what we're really talking about is neuronal signaling, or the transmission of information from one part of the brain to another. And we can break that down into a series of steps that will be covered on these two slides. So the first stage is that the soma, or the cell, initiates the signaling process. This signal is then transmitted along an axon, and once it reaches the end of the axon, or the synaptic region, it's converted to chemical neurotransmitters of various types. Those chemicals then diffuse across that gap called the synaptic gap, that gap within the synapse, and they're then reconverted to electrical signals on the other side of the gap. Once they reach the other side, the postsynaptic neuron, now what does that mean? That means the neuron that's on the other side of the synapse, the neuron that's actually receiving the signal. So that postsynaptic neuron sums up signals from many inputs. And some of these inputs are excitatory and some are inhibitory. And so some would, because of the chemistry that goes on, some would make the cell more likely to switch and actually fire up an action potential or a potential signal. Others would make it less likely. So it's like you're taking an algebraic sum of excitatory and inhibitory signals. And when the excitatory signals reach some threshold and are greater than some threshold, then the neurons will fire an action potential. So one thing to keep in mind is the action potentials are basically all identical waveforms. They have the same magnitude, and so given a set of neurons and a set of brain chemistry parameters, those action potentials look the same. So the intensity of the signal that we read is actually a function of the firing rate, as opposed to the amplitude of an individual action potential. So if we look at the cerebral cortex, this is just a cross-section of the cerebral cortex, and these folded sections of the brain are what we are referring to when we say cerebral cortex. The part of the cerebral cortex that we can actually sense from outside the brain is 2 to 3 millimeters thick. It's responsible for processing sensation, learning, voluntary movement, speech perception. It's got this, what we call convoluted cortical surface, and that's referring to these folds. So it has many folds. These actually show up after birth, after infancy. The cortex develops its folds. The surface area is about 2.5 square meters, and it contains more than 10 billion neurons. So once again, this is open source. Throughout all of the figures used in these lectures are from OpenCourseWare or open source materials, meaning that for reuse purposes, the author or the person who posted the figures gives their unlimited permission.